Hello, my name is Claire Atkinson and I'm one of the children's physiotherapists with Highland Council. I've been asked to put together a video resource for parents or carers of children with persistent fatigue, discussing how energy management strategies can be used to help them. I've put this resource together benefiting from the experience of many of my multidisciplinary colleagues who also work with children experiencing persistent fatigue, and I hope that you find this resource useful. This resource will be in 4 parts, so feel free to navigate ahead to the section that is most relevant to you. Part 1 will give you an overview of what persistent fatigue is, what causes it, what it looks like, which young people are most at risk of experiencing it, and when is it a medically diagnosable condition. In Part 2 we'll consider together the principles of energy management, including the boom and bust cycle, or the recovery cycle, energy conservation and pacing, and how these can help a young person to recover from persistent fatigue. The video in Part 3 will introduce 3 tools which you can use with your young person in order to help them manage their energy levels and do the activities that are most valuable to them, and hopefully gradually increase the amount they are able to do. Finally, Part 4 is a separate video made alongside Carrie Watts from Thriving Families, demonstrating these tools being used in conversation to identify and prioritise changes that young people can make in order to promote their recovery and cope with fatigue in their daily life. Firstly, it's important for us to recognise that it's normal for our energy levels to fluctuate during the day and over time. This depends on a huge number of factors relating to our physical, mental and emotional well-being, our environment, what activities we have been, are doing and are anticipating doing. This is normal. We all know the feeling of feeling more tired on a Monday morning perhaps than on a Friday. This is the same for our young people. Fatigue is a normal physiological response to moderate or intense exercise, illness, poor quality sleep, stressful events, intense emotions, and many other aspects of a young person's life. Fatigue is normally brought on by a stressor. We'll discuss what these are a bit more in the next slide, but it's relieved when that stress is removed, after a recovery period that's appropriate to activity. To put this in context, we all know that it will take us longer to recover from a 10k run than if we were to go out and do a 2k one. In some young people, fatigue persists after that original stressor is taken away, or it takes longer than you'd expect for them to recover from that. Persistent fatigue can also happen with no obvious trigger. Although there are theories and a growing body of research, we don't fully understand why persistent fatigue happens in some but not others, or why autistic and perhaps also ADHD young people appear more susceptible to it. It's important to recognise that persistent, sometimes called chronic or unexplained fatigue, presents differently in children than adults. Physical fatigue isn't always as obvious, particularly in younger or previously very active young people, perhaps because their baseline activity is a bit higher to start with than some adults. In young people, fatigue sometimes isn't picked up on until changes in behaviour take place, so you might not notice it until your young person starts opting out of sports activities, having difficulty getting up from school, sleeping more, or opting to go out less with friends, perhaps complaining of being tired. This can be challenging to work out the cause, as these changes can also be caused by many other things. The good news is that most young people with persistent fatigue improve significantly, most recover fully, and almost all improve to some extent. Research shows that pacing activities is beneficial both to improve their coping with fatigue and to promote recovery from it. Pacing is also an effective tool for young people with fatigue that can be explained, whether that's explainable by other medical conditions, other neurodevelopmental factors, or other factors in their life. Fatigue that lasts for more than a month should always be investigated by a medical professional. If it's continued for more than 3 months, and medical tests have ruled out other known explanations for fatigue, a consultant may sometimes give a young person a diagnosis of chronic fatigue. We'll discuss this briefly later on. There are some links to some useful resources regarding this at the end of the presentation. I should say that the National Clinical Guidance on Unexplained Fatigue or Chronic Fatigue does sometimes say 1 month rather than 3, but in practice 3 months is often used as a minimum. This resource, however, aims at providing information, hopefully to help you assist your young person, whatever the cause of their fatigue. We're going to discuss pacing a lot more in sections 2 and 3, so hopefully you'll find that useful. At its most basic form, fatigue is caused when the energy a young person is using exceeds the energy they have available. But what kind of things do we use energy for? There are very few things within the human body that don't require energy, even sleeping. It's useful to think of it as 3 different categories of energy that a young person uses every day. There are others, and there are other ways to classify this. When we're talking about fatigue, most people instantly think of it as tiredness caused by physical activities. Things like sport, walking to school, carrying a school bag, and maybe chores around the house. Less obvious physical tasks for young folk are things like sitting up to do work at school or to read. Travelling, which actually takes quite a lot of small adjustments of your body, your eyes, and accommodation of your brain to cope with the movement. Moving the muscles in our eyes also takes a reasonable amount of energy. To read, to scroll through a phone, to watch TV, or to switch between looking at work on the desk and looking at work that might be on the board at school. For young people with significant fatigue, the less obvious energy drains can often be missed. The second category, in the blue circle there, thinks about cognitive activity. Most young people will be tired when they come out of an exam or when they start school for the first time. Thinking is hard work. There are obvious cognitive tasks in a child's life, like schoolwork, practicing new skills, reading, but following the plot of a TV show or a book, having a conversation, and planning or reflecting on what they've done that day also take quite a lot of energy. It's easy to see how the amount of energy needed can vary. Take conversation. This can be more or less draining depending on what your child's talking about, who they're talking to, and where they are. Emotional energy in the red circle is one that's most often overlooked, perhaps because it's the hardest to spot in other people. I'm sure we all recognise in ourselves that managing strong emotions, whether they're positive or negative, is tiring. Most parents have experienced the fatigue of managing the over-enthusiasm and excitement of a small child at some point, so it's not just negative emotions that take energy to manage. Again, there's an individual aspect to this. How draining your young person finds emotion-provoking events or media content will vary depending on lots of things, including their personality. That's why I often find this analogy of a battery useful to talk to young people about the amount of energy they have. You might want to consider sharing this slide with a young person or share this explanation with them. We all have a battery of energy which needs time to recharge when it's used up. When we've got no energy left, we're not able to function normally. Everybody's battery has a different capacity, and this capacity changes from day to day and over time. Young children have a smaller battery than an adult. Different activities cause varying amounts and speed of energy drain for different people. So for example, a PE session in athletics at school will drain far less energy from a young person who runs in their local athletics club than their friends. A child with dyslexia will find homework reading much harder than their sibling who doesn't have dyslexia. An autistic child might find the school Christmas party more draining than their peers because of the sensory and social demands of it. The profile of what your young person finds depletes their energy the most will vary depending on huge factors. You'll find some of those listed in the slide. Working out what drains your child's battery the most can be a really useful way to prioritise what will give them the biggest win in terms of saving some energy that they can either spend on something else or spread that energy better through the day. It can also give you a really useful starting point of who to contact for support if you're finding it difficult to work out how you can reduce your child's energy demands. If it's physical tasks they're struggling with the most, you might want to contact Just Ask and speak to a physio or an occupational therapy if it's self-care. Perhaps if they're struggling with managing their cognitive demands, then perhaps you'd seek advice from their school teacher, ASN department, or maybe educational psychology. If the biggest trigger for their fatigue is emotional demands, then perhaps support from school counsellors, asking school to consult with primary mental health, or by contacting Just Ask and speaking to a primary mental health worker yourself might be useful. The resources and links to how you get in touch with these people are at the end of the presentation. Also, don't forget the environment in which all of these things happen has an impact on how tiring and fatiguing it is. To give you an example, as I record this, I'm aware that because of the lighting in the room and the setup that I've got, that I have more eye strain than I would have normally. It's also worth mentioning that young people with fatigue often seem worse with heat. So thinking about temperature and timing perhaps of hot baths or length of hot baths can be an easy energy win that often young people don't think of. So I wanted to finish off this section just considering what a diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome is, what it might mean, and why it may or may not be appropriate for your child. I should say that most children with persistent fatigue don't necessarily have chronic fatigue syndrome. This video resource is intended to be useful for parents of children and young people, both with chronic fatigue syndrome and with persistent fatigue, which is explained by other things, so neurodevelopmental differences, physical health conditions, learning delays, or anything else. So in order to make it most accessible to the most number of people, if you feel you have an explanation for your child's fatigue, feel free to skip over this slide and turn to section 2, where we'll pick up on some strategies to manage their fatigue. So what is chronic fatigue syndrome, sometimes called ME? Firstly, I'm aware that some people are not always happy with the language of chronic fatigue because it brings with it a kind of expectation that this will be long lasting. And the good news for children and young people with chronic fatigue is that the majority of them, as we said earlier, do recover. However, this is the terminology used in the kind of national guideline document, which I've linked to in the slide there. So that's the terminology I'm going to stick with. So the criterion for diagnosing chronic fatigue is a young person has to have significant fatigue, which impacts on their daily life. It has to have been going on for at least a month in the clinical guideline. Most consultants will look for a minimum of 3 months of symptoms, if not slightly longer, before they'll consider giving a diagnosis. And this diagnosis would usually be given by a consultant. The significant fatigue that would be seen would be associated with sleeping issues. So unrefreshing sleep, which is sleep that they wake up from not feeling rested, or sleep disturbances. The fatigue would be worsened by activity. One of the kind of key features of fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome is that there's often a delay between the activity and the onset of fatigue. So a young person will do something, perhaps walk home from school, and they will feel fatigue not straight away, but perhaps later on that evening or even into the next day. And the fatigue is always disproportionate to what they've done and how much activity they've done, and the recovery from that fatigue takes longer than would be expected. It's often associated with kind of cognitive difficulties, which is often described as kind of brain fog. It might be associated with some other kind of somatic or body symptoms, so things like headaches, dizziness, perhaps fainting. If you want to know a little bit more about those somatic symptoms, I'd suggest going across and having a look at the NICE guidelines themselves. They detail them all. The significant fatigue also has to be not caused by anything that we can explain. So kind of excess exertion in any sphere. So a child who is pushing themselves too much physically, perhaps to train for something, obviously their fatigue is explainable. And again, any diagnosis of chronic fatigue would be given by a consultant after other kind of explanations that we have for fatigue in young people are ruled out. So it's really important, if you have any concerns that this describes your child, that you make contact with your child's GP, or if they're already under a paediatrician, to speak to them. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. But more importantly, let's pop on to section 2 and have a think about what you as parents and carers can perhaps do to help your young person's fatigue, to help them manage the fatigue they've got, and hopefully to recover from that fatigue. So just before we move on to part 2 of this presentation, if you're moving straight between one and the other, I'd encourage you just to take a few minutes to stop and reflect on what we've discussed so far, and maybe to jot down what one thing has jumped out at you from the information that I've shared so far. And perhaps have you recognised anything that might be draining your child's battery that you hadn't thought of before? And it might be useful to jot that down, and in the next section we'll have a little think about how potentially you could reduce the impact of that on them. Okay, see you in section 2.